Hans Christian Andersen wrote a famous children's story titled The Emperor's New Clothes. It's about a king who's obsessed with wearing fancy attire. Some con men realize they can get rich by promising to make the king an outfit using the most amazing material. The material is said to be unimaginably beautiful to everyone, except to stupid people who can't see it at all. The con men pretend to weave the fabric, even though they're only weaving a lie. They understand that people don't want to be called stupid and that people will pretend to see the fabric even when there's nothing there, simply to avoid being called stupid. So the king's officials and the king himself praise the non-existent new garb. It's so beautiful. It's marvelous. I've never seen anything like it. The con men eventually make off like bandits as the king parades himself through the town, stark raving naked. These con men in Andersen's story apparently took a page from Muhammad's playbook, although they seem like mere amateurs when compared with the Prophet of Islam. Nearly 14 centuries ago, Muhammad spent 23 years delivering bits and pieces of what eventually would become this book, the Quran. Many of his contemporaries mocked his verses, and I don't see how any honest critic can regard the Quran as anything other than a disaster. The British philosopher of religion, Antony Flew, said that to read the Quran is a penance rather than a pleasure. And yet, the Quran is praised by 1.6 billion Muslims as the most spectacular and breathtaking book in the world. How did this happen? To find out, let's read two verses of the Quran, chapter 33, verse 36. It is not for a believer, man or woman, when Allah and His Messenger have decreed a matter, that they should have any option in their decision. And whoever disobeys Allah and His Messenger, he has indeed strayed into a plain error. Notice, once a decision has been made by Allah and Muhammad, a true believer's only option is obedience, which means that if you don't obey, or if you even think you've got other options, you're not a true believer. Chapter 4, verse 65. But know, by your Lord, they can have no faith until they make you, O Muhammad, judge in all disputes between them and find in themselves no resistance against your decisions and accept them with full submission. Muslims can have no real faith until they find in themselves no resistance against Muhammad's decisions. If you have any resistance at all to what Muhammad says, you're not a real Muslim. Why is this important? Well, if you've recited the Shahada, but you turn out not to be a Muslim because you don't obey Allah or because you doubt Muhammad's commands, the penalty for apostasy is death. Sunan an-Nasai 4069. The Messenger of Allah said, whoever changes his religion, kill him. So if you show the slightest doubt about anything said by Allah or Muhammad, you run the risk of having your head chopped off. Not surprisingly, the tendency among Muslims for the past 14 centuries has been to praise all things Islamic with ever-increasing zeal, regardless of that irritating burden we call reality. Let's look at a few examples. In his book, 23 Years, Iranian scholar Ali Dashti writes, the Quran contains sentences which are incomplete and not fully intelligible without the aid of commentaries, foreign words, unfamiliar Arabic words, and words used with other than the normal meaning, adjectives and verbs inflected without observance of the concords of gender and number, illogically and ungrammatically applied pronouns which sometimes have no referent, and predicates which in rhymed passages are often remote from the subjects. These and other such aberrations in the language have given scope to critics who deny the Quran's eloquence. Gerd Puin, the world's foremost authority on Quranic paleography, says this: the Quran claims for itself that it is mubin, or clear. But if you look at it, you will notice that every fifth sentence or so simply doesn't make sense. Many Muslims and Orientalists will tell you otherwise, of course, but the fact is that a fifth of the Quranic text is just incomprehensible. This is what has caused the traditional anxiety regarding translation. If the Quran is not comprehensible, if it can't even be understood in Arabic, then it's not translatable. People fear that. And since the Quran claims repeatedly to be clear, but obviously is not, as even speakers of Arabic will tell you, there is a contradiction. How do Muslims respond to the incoherence of their confused and incomprehensible book? The Quran is a miracle of eloquence and clarity, so perfect in the beauty of its expression that unbelievers must cover their ears and flee, lest it should instantly penetrate the dark recesses of their hard hearts. What about science? The Quran claims that the sun sets in a muddy pool, that semen is formed between the backbone and ribs, that the earth is flat, that there are 7 earths, that the sun orbits the earth, that human embryos go through a blood clot stage, that the sky would fall on the earth if Allah didn't hold it up, and that stars are missiles that Allah uses to shoot demons who try to sneak into heaven. How do Muslims respond when they read this scientific catastrophe? The Quran is a scientific miracle filled with biological and astronomical insights that couldn't be proven until centuries after they were revealed. This is conclusive proof that the Quran comes from God. What about ethics? The Quran commands Muslims to violently subjugate Jews and Christians and to kill other non-Muslims. It tells Muslim men that it's okay to beat their rebellious wives into submission and to rape their female captives and slaves and to have sex with prepubescent girls. The Quran advocates dismembering people and crucifying them. And since the Quran calls Muhammad the pattern of conduct for Muslims, we have to add torturing people for money to the list because Muhammad tortured people for money. How do Muslims respond when they read the book that's caused more violence and oppression than any other book in history? It's a miracle that any book could ever reach such lofty heights of moral perfection. The Quran is like a cloud, raining down drops of purity and righteousness on blah, 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 blah. What about the textual preservation of the Quran? According to Muslim sources, entire chapters of the Quran were lost or forgotten. Large passages of the Quran were lost. Individual verses were lost. Words were lost. Muhammad's best reciters couldn't even agree on which chapters were supposed to be included in the Quran, and Uthman had to burn countless manuscripts to cover up all the differences. How do Muslims respond when they read what their sources say about the textual history of the Quran? It's a miracle that the Quran has been perfectly preserved right down to the letter from the moment it was first revealed to Muhammad until now. Why do Muslims say, with mind-boggling fervor, the exact opposite of what the evidence so clearly proves? Never underestimate the psychological pressure of a potential beheading, my friends. Over the centuries, the Muslim community was conditioned to behave this way. What's interesting is that even when Muslims live in the West and aren't under threat of death, they continue praising the Quran as the greatest book ever just because that's what they've been taught to do. It's what their parents do, it's what their leaders do, it's what their friends do, so it's just what Muslims do, despite the fact that the Quran is an incoherent mess. So what is the Quran? The Quran is a book that fails miserably in every possible way, but which makes up for its numerous blunders and shortcomings with threats and intimidation. There are two ways for a book to gain a reputation as the greatest book ever written. The first is to actually be the greatest book ever written. The second is to threaten to brutally murder anyone who says it's not the greatest book ever written. Islam, as it always does, takes the path of violence. Why? Because it works. Just ask any of the world's 1.6 billion Muslims what they think about the Quran, and you'll see how effective Muhammad's methods were. At the end of The Emperor's New Clothes, as the king struts naked through the city, reveling in the praises of a population that pretends to see his beautiful clothes, there's one young boy who doesn't fall for the ruse. The boy yells, "Look, he's got no clothes!" That's when the crowd starts to realize that they've been deceived. You Muslims who are watching this, you've been deceived. That doesn't mean you have to stay that way.